my monsters. So glad you could join us for today's episode. I don't know about you, but this time of year, I am ready to devour any and everything spooky, which includes a heaping helping of bizarre murder stories. If you feel the same way, we've got you covered. We started our very own true crime cult so that all of our spooky friends have a place to go for non-stop creepy content. But never fear, you've landed in the cult with all of the adorable baby goats and none of the police standoffs. In case you're just joining us for the very first time today, allow us to introduce ourselves. I'm Angelina, and I'm here with my petrifying pal, Aurora. How are things on your end?
I'm so great. I'm so ready to be in the very middle of spooky season and planning costumes and things. How are you doing?
This is the most fun part. I totally agree. I'm doing great. I had already one Halloween-y event, which was great. I did a Halloween roller skating event, and I was a roller skating Wednesday Addams because that's my easiest costume to throw together. So
we are going to need pictures of that, please.
Oh, I will post pictures. Actually, there was some pro photographers there, so I've got a few good selections that are better than what I would have taken. So that's good.
Cute. Cannot wait. It's fun to imagine yourself as an honorary cult member as you listen to our show. But if you'd like to make it official, you can join the MMN commune on Patreon. You'll find us at patreon.com/MurderMurder.news. And you can pledge whatever amount you decide we deserve. Hopefully that's a lot. And show your support for all that we do. In return, we'll give you a shout out on the show, your own official title like Grandmaster of Goats. And you'll have exclusive access to our special patron-only content like our monthly special videos. Tune in at the end of October to hear about the Annabelle story and where that comes from.
Ooh, I can't wait for that either.
Yes.
And speaking of which, we want to give a shout out to Petra, who has just joined us on Patreon. Welcome to the cult, Petra. We've named your honorary baby goat Esmeralda. So let's kick things off with some of the true crime stories that made headlines this week.
An Iowa teen found covered in blood admitted to killing his parents with an axe to take charge of his life. 17-year-old Ethan Orton faces 2 counts of first-degree murder and the deaths of his parents, 42-year-old Casey Arthur Orton and 41-year-old Misty Dawn Scott Slade. Calm when police arrived in the early morning hours of Friday, October 15th, Orton is now being held at the Lynn County Detention Center on a $2 million bond.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Female human remains found in Allen County, Michigan last Friday afternoon are still being investigated, but are believed to belong to missing Abby Hill. Hill, 31, was reported missing on October 5th and is wanted on 2 felony warrants stemming from an incident that took place in late September involving unlawful imprisonment and illegal possession of a firearm. Michigan State Police say they will release new information in the coming days on their Twitter page. Now, before we get into our story, we just want to say that while our tone is light in the intro, we do take the topics we're discussing very seriously. We are best buds, and we love chatting together every week and turning it into a podcast. We want to share that passion with you and to create a vibe where all of you feel like our best buds too. We joke about us friends forming a cult or commune, but that's not to diminish the severity of actual cult activity, which we do occasionally talk about in our weekly stories. We feel it's important to open up and talk about even the darkest aspects of humanity and the downright scary things that come up in the news. But we want to make it clear that our intention is never to sensationalize, and we always try to deliver these stories with respect to all parties involved or affected by the crimes we discuss.
We always post our sources in the episode description, so you can do some digging on your own if a story we present piques your interest. But you should know that if you ever feel we get it wrong, either in our tone or in the details of the case, we want to hear about it. We are more than happy to make a correction or give an update on a case we've discussed in previous episodes. So feel free to reach out to us at MurderMurder.news@gmail.com. Some specific trigger warnings for this episode include sexual assault, personality disorders, manipulation, and extremely graphic descriptions of brutal physical violence. If any of these are particularly sensitive subjects for you, feel free to skip this one and listen to one of our other episodes instead.
This week marks the 32nd anniversary of a case from Australian true crime history, that of the so-called Lesbian Vampire Killer. As a Reddit user claiming to be related to the killer put it, not like Buffy. This isn't the story of a badass lesbian who killed vampires, though I would absolutely watch that series. Netflix, take heed.
Mm-hmm.
This case is also not to be confused with the 2009 British horror comedy film called Lesbian Vampire Killers, in which a couple of dudes set out to slay a group of lesbian vampires who stole their girlfriends.
Eek. I don't know about
In
that.
fact, this is the story of a lesbian vampire who killed. If the moniker sounds a bit sensational and a little disrespectful to you, well, I'm with you on that. Later, we'll get into some of the reasons why this story has been so sensational in Australian culture and why the perpetrator's sexuality was a relevant plot point. But first, let's dig into the events of October 21st, 1989. This one is a late-night tale, and taking place at the height of spooky season, it has all the tropes, beginning with witches and vampires.
Let's meet our cast of characters. 24-year-old Tracey Wiggington, the lesbian vampire killer herself. Her secret lesbian lover, 24-year-old Lisa Paczynski. Kim Jervis and Tracy Ann Waugh, both 23, were also lovers. Tracy and Lisa had been seeing each other for about 2 weeks at this point. They met Kim and Tracy Ann while hanging out at the bar scene in Brisbane's Fortitude Valley. All four belong to a loosely defined Brisbane subculture known as the swampies. Swampies were goths and Doc Martens with occult-themed tattoos. And with nocturnal lifestyles, swampies made the perfect cohorts for a self-described vampire like Tracey Wiggington. Kim had dark eyes and dressed really gothy. She had this satin vest with bats on it, and she wore it all the time. She was allegedly a member of the local satanic coven, a coven that Tracy was thinking about joining. Kim was known for being pretty into vampires. Kim's girlfriend, Tracy Ann, was more of a quiet goth. On this night, the friends were clad in all black, and for Tracy Ann, that meant a dress, stockings, and black dress shoes. She was also in a coven, but a separate one from the coven Kim was in. Lisa was a really wild child and troubled young woman who saw the inside of a hospital 80 times in 5 years for episodes of self-harm and mental health crises. She had a bad habit of frequently slitting her wrists. You won't be surprised to learn that Lisa was also in a coven. All four women were allegedly in different covens at the time, but Tracy was having some issues in her coven and she was shopping around. Lisa said lately she had been cutting open her wrist or hand and letting Tracy drink her blood. But Lisa had a heart condition and couldn't afford to keep giving Tracy blood, so the gang started planning to find another food source.
Lisa said that Tracy never ate solid food and subsisted on an exclusive diet of blood and only blood. Allegedly, she would regularly put in special orders at the local butcher shop for pig and goat blood. Tracy was also known to avoid mirrors, and she only went out at night. Despite meeting only a few weeks before, Tracey Wigginton already had her friends under her spell. They often participated in rituals where they would bow down to Tracy, who was backlit by bright, flickering candlelight, and stare at her until their eyes blurred. The vision of Tracy would fade away to nothing, leaving only, quote, cat eyes staring back at us. Tracy impressed her creepy friends with tales of generational Satanism and witchcraft. She told them that when she was abandoned by her parents and adopted by her grandparents as a child, her grandmother Avril introduced her to the occult. Tracy had been allegedly indoctrinated into Avril's coven, but began to feel that she was outgrowing it. So this 80s goth gang of witchy vampires hit the town in Fortitude Valley. It all sounds very cinematic, and you can begin to see why it took the media by storm. The week before, I guess the group had had a midnight picnic at Tuong Cemetery and took home a fallen headstone. But on this night, they started at their fave local spot, a lesbian bar called L'Amours. They told the bartender that instead of their usuals, they were drinking bubbly, because I guess it was a special evening. After several sparkling glasses, they left the bar around 11:30 p.m. Then they went cruising around to find a victim, someone whose blood Tracy could drink.
Enter Edward Baldock, a 47-year-old man who was so drunk he couldn't walk straight, who was trying to hail a cab from outside a bar in Kangaroo Point. Edward was a bar-level expert dart player, and that day he had won the big game and spent the evening drinking free beer and celebrating with his friends at the Caledonian Club. Leaving the bar before midnight, Baldock had a wife and 4 kids who he was eager to get home to. But when a car full of spooky young women pulled up to the curb where he was standing, Edward was easily lured to hop into Tracy's green Commodore and go for a ride as the girls promised him sex at their destination. Again, he was so drunk, he was actually falling asleep in the car on the way. Soon they reached Orley Park, which was at the Brisbane River near the Brisbane Sailing Club in the West End. Edward and Tracy got out of the car and found a nice grassy area to sit down. Tracy instructed the man to remove his clothing, and he complied, folding his garments neatly and tucking the stack just under the rolling door of the nearby rowing clubhouse, along with his shoes and wallet. Tracy removed her shirt, but told Edward she was going to go pee before they got started and ducked away to find a good bush to pee in. But she really ran back to the car to gather her accomplices. "This guy is too strong. I need help," she said. In court testimony, the girls said they believed at this point the plan was just to scare their victim, get him to take his clothes off and drive away and leave him there. But we're not convinced that there was any doubt as to what the plan was for Baldock. Just 2 days before, Kim Jervis purchased one of the knives that would become murder weapons. One day before, Tracy forced her friends to watch video footage of a real beheading over and over again, as if she were trying to desensitize them.
Before we continue, I'm going to issue another warning. This particular scene I'm about to describe is extremely graphic. The reason we decided to share all the gory details of Edward Baldock's murder is so that you understand why this crime shook Australia so hard. It had been described by many as the most bizarre and brutal murder the country has ever seen. And that's saying a lot when you think about the fact that the film Wolf Creek was based on a true story out of Australia. Because this crime was so particularly strange and gruesome, it sparked a media frenzy of sensational headlines such as, "Killer was devil's wife with power to control minds," and "Lesbian Vampire Killer lured man with a promise of sex before killing him for his blood." So Lisa Pachinski and Kim Jervis hopped out of the car to lend a hand. Tracy Ann pleaded with her girlfriend to get back in the car and not go any further with this dark ritual. Tracy Ann never set foot outside the vehicle, and from her vantage point, couldn't even make out the outline of Baldock's figure on the dark riverbank. Prince's Bat Dance blared from the car stereo, serving as the soundtrack to the attack. Tracy and Lisa returned to sitting duck Baldock, both gripping knives that Tracy had sharpened on rocks the day before. Lisa held the knife up over her head, poised to strike first, but when Edward looked straight at Lisa, she froze and couldn't go through with it. Edward said, "What are you doing?" Tracy replied, "Nothing," and then stabbed him in the back. Edward tried to grab Tracy's hand, and she plunged her knife into his neck. Grabbing the second knife from Lisa, Tracy launched into a vicious attack that Lisa likened to a shark's feeding frenzy. Tracy withdrew the first knife and stabbed the man again in the other side of the neck. Continuously stabbing with one hand, she used her other hand to pull her victim's head up by the hair, and then she slashed the knife across his throat. Edward began to make gurgling noises and rolled over onto his side. Tracy resumed stabbing his neck, trying to cut the nerves and break the bones. Blood began to spurt out from Edward's throat and welled around his writhing body on the ground. She had stabbed him at least 27 times. His head was nearly completely severed, but despite his major injuries, Baldock was still alive at this point. Tracy stepped back to admire her handiwork. Later, she admitted to feeling nothing in this moment. She crouched beside the rowing clubhouse and smoked a cigarette, watching the life drain from Edward Baldock.
Next, her friends alleged that Tracy dove face first into Edward's neck and drank as much of his blood as she could handle without throwing up. She wiped her face in a towel that she tossed into the back of the car and then chucked the knives into the river, where she also washed the blood off her arms. Tracy put her shirt back on and walked back to the car, where Tracy Ann Waugh remembers that she could smell the blood on her friend's breath. The whole attack lasted about 30 minutes. Meanwhile, Elaine Baldock, the victim's wife, immediately realized something was amiss when her husband wasn't home by midnight. He was never late, and in the unlikely event that something had come up, he absolutely would have called to let her know. By 2 a.m., Elaine had filed a missing persons report, but Edward wouldn't be missing for long. At 5 a.m. the next morning, rower Stephen Caron saw something strange from the water as he rowed past the South Brisbane Sailing Club, and he pulled up on the shore to get a closer look. What Caron saw at the riverbank in Orley Park was so incredibly disturbing that none who had gazed upon it would have been able to shake it from their minds. Stephen Caron stood by to redirect morning joggers as the police were summoned, and the scene was roped off to protect curious onlookers as a forensic pathologist conducted a full examination. The first officer to arrive on the scene was Police Chief Patrick Glancy, who feels he has been forever changed by the sight he saw that morning. Glancy had already had a long career in law enforcement and had investigated many murders before the murder of Edward Baldock. And still, it left a lasting impression on him due to the sheer brutality of the attack.
The victim was naked except for his socks. His body lay in a twisted, unnatural position. He was covered in stab wounds, including one the size of a tea saucer in the middle of his throat. Examiners noted 2 gaping wounds surrounded by 14, quote, satellite stab wounds, which is an expression I hadn't heard before, but I found it an interesting descriptor. Baldock had lost control of his bowels, and there was an extraordinary amount of bloodshed on the scene. Baldock's own entire body had been left coated in blood. The spine and the neck and the spinal cord were cut 3/4 of the way through. The 2 main arteries on the left side of the neck were completely severed. The jugular vein was partially severed. The chest had 3 additional stab wounds. When examiners turned over the body, the head stayed in place and did not turn with it, which goes to show just how close Tracy came to decapitating her victim. There was also evidence that after Baldock's death, someone had dug their fingers into the wounds. Investigators figured they were looking for a very large perpetrator with considerable strength, likely a man. But as a formality, they had to check out every clue they found, even one which led them to the front door of a young woman. With Baldock's body nearly unrecognizable, police were able to identify the victim when they found his stack of clothes nearby and his wallet on top of the pile. Inside the wallet was a bank card marked with the name of Edward Baldock. Inside his shoe, neatly placed beside the stack of clothes, was another bank card bearing the name of Tracey Wiggington.
Tracy's live-in girlfriend Debbie answered the door and explained that Tracy was drowsy after Debbie had given her sleeping pills in the early morning hours. Tracy had taken a late night walk to Orley Park, as she sometimes did, and came home inconsolable, claiming she had seen a dead body. While police interviewed Debbie, Tracy came into the room exclaiming, "So it was real?" and getting upset all over again. We can't tell you much about Debbie, and we're not sure how much of Tracy's lifestyle she was aware of, but we do know that Tracy and Debbie had an open relationship. Nonetheless, Tracy didn't particularly enjoy hearing Debbie with lovers in the next room night after night. Tracy later described feeling a compulsive urge to kill in those moments and said that she had not gone on a hunt for another victim. It would have surely been Debbie who she murdered. The police actually bought Tracy's story of being so distressed by stumbling across a dead body, mostly because they weren't looking for a suspect who fit Tracy's description. While she was tall with broad shoulders and had a very commanding presence, she was also a woman, and the officers were sure that it was a man, and if not multiple men, who were responsible for the violent attack. As the host of the podcast, Murder in the Land of Oz, put it, after all, it was a murder. According to the Australia Institute of Criminology, between 1990 and 1991, only 10% of homicide offenders were female. The cops let Miss Wiggington know that her bank card was found at the scene of the crime, and she explained that's what she was doing at the park so late. When she got home from an outing with friends, she discovered she had lost her bank card. She headed right back to check the park where she and her friends had walked earlier, but when she thought she saw a dead body, she turned around immediately and forgot all about the bank card. Tracy mused that maybe the victim had found her bank card in the grass and picked it up before he had met his untimely demise. But before the officers took Tracy's word and left her apartment, they received word from the station that Lisa Paczynski had turned herself in and decided to instead bring Tracey Wiggington in for questioning. Investigators found it odd how quickly Tracy flipped a switch and went from acting like she had no knowledge of the murder, and convincingly so, to openly admitting her crime. They had taken her statement that she had no involvement when an officer let Tracy know that her friends had ratted her out. "Put the tape back in, I'll tell you what happened," she said tersely. In the interview, Tracy said she felt nothing as she watched her victim die. She also said that as she watched the light go out in his eyes, he held her hand and she presumed he was a lonely man.
Which, of course, he was not. Edward Baldock had a big family who cared about him. I'd like to point out that the trouble with crimes like this being so sensationalized is that while there are lesbian vampire killers to discuss, nobody has much to say about the boring old victim. Edward Baldock wasn't a witch or a stylish goth. He was a randomly chosen, innocent victim. His family resented that if the papers or the public ever did discuss any details about Edward, they often portrayed him as a drunk because he was out at the bar the night he was abducted and murdered. But that wasn't Edward. In reality, his daughter, also coincidentally named Tracy, explained to 9 News Australia that her father had just been so good at darts and such a good sport that he deserved to win the competition that day, and he deserved to celebrate that win that he was so proud of with his friends. Baldock had been a father of 5, a detail that was often misreported because his oldest, Tracy, was no longer living at home. She actually had 2 little boys of her own, to whom Edward was a doting grandfather. He was a fun dad and a fun grandfather. He didn't like to sit at home. He would much rather spend the day at the beach horsing around. His favorite meal was pizza, and he had a gross tradition of rounding up everything in the fridge and putting a little bit of everything atop his homemade pizza pies. Tracy told News 9 that while her father and her son's grandfather was stolen from her, they can never take away her memories of him or the uncanny resemblance her boys bear to Edward. Tracey Wigginton quickly entered a guilty plea. Her trial actually didn't have time to become a sensation because it only lasted a whopping 9 minutes. It was when her witchy accomplices went to trial that the world heard all about dark rituals, vampiristic tendencies, and the mind control tactics that the girls believed Tracy had employed. When a case is this big and this weird, with this much shock value, right at the height of the satanic panic that was sweeping the nations of Australia and America alike, both the prosecution and the defense understand the value of a good story. A story which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Every action has an explanation, and everyone involved is either innocent or guilty.
The legal team defending Lisa Paczynski, Kim Jarvis, and Tracy Ann Waugh painted a picture of Tracy as the charismatic leader of the group. They implied that Tracy was so influential that her friends went along with her every whim, feeling completely unable to say no to her. The story in court was that the girls hadn't realized that Tracy was serious about killing someone and had believed that it had all been a joke until it was too late. And that the girls believed Tracy really did have magical powers and had seen evidence of it. In lieu of magical powers, what Tracy really had was a rough history with mental illness. Having been diagnosed with multiple personalities, now known as dissociative identity disorder, several of Australia's leading psychologists agreed that Tracy was the real deal. 6 distinct personalities had been identified as part of Tracy's system, and experts believe that it may have been one of Tracy's alters who committed the murder. It may have been an alter who had made these new friends in Fortitude Valley and started a secret fling with Lisa Paczynski.
But as is always the case when dissociative identity disorder comes up in criminal trials, the theory was not unanimous. As long as there's been talk about the personality disorder, there has also been naysayers. Many psychologists dispute the existence of the disorder at all and suggest the patients are just faking it. But believers in DID point out that it's unlikely that these ordinary criminals are Oscar-worthy performers, and it's more likely that their described histories with trauma and mental illness are legitimate. According to a psychologist's report, Wigginton's personalities included Little Tracy, a childlike, innocent personality, maybe a throwback to Wigginton's own lost childhood. Big Tracy, a woman with severe depression. The Observer, an icy, disconnected personality. The Observer is the only one who is aware of the other personalities and could make statements about them. Bobby, a rough, crude, kind of tough guy personality. And Avril, the reincarnation of Tracy's abusive grandmother who she was raised by. Some have speculated that it was Bobby who had committed the murder and that it was little Tracy that placed her own bank card in Baldock's shoe, hoping to be caught. While under psychological evaluation, Wigginton underwent hypnosis to help understand and outline each of her alter personalities. While hypnotized, Tracy also uttered a famous line that has been printed in most publications about her. Quote, "I'd like to slice off the top of someone's head and say, 'Think, let me see you think.'" Regardless, none of this speculation nor Tracy's clinical diagnosis were accepted in court, and she was found fit to stand trial. Again, I'll point out that what that means is that the court found that Tracy understood what she was being charged with and understood that she was on trial. If one wants to take an insanity plea, that implies that even at the moment of the trial, which could be months or even years after the crime, they are still too detached from reality to even realize what the heck is going on or what they're being charged with. I fully disagree with the way things like this are handled because I'm quite sure that someone can be mentally detached while committing a crime, but can come to and realize what has happened by the time they stand trial. Either way, it seems like that's the way it went down for Tracy, and her guilty plea was accepted.
No one besides Tracey Wiggington would plead guilty, but she wasn't alone in being sentenced for Baldock's death. A jury convicted Tracey Wiggington of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. Lisa Baczynski was also convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, but was released in 2008 when her application for resettlement leave was approved by the Queensland Parole Board. Kim Jervis was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 years in jail, which was later reduced to 12 years. Tracy Ann Waugh managed to evade any kind of conviction, sentencing, or punishment. The fact that she never got out of the car at the park and that she tried to talk her girlfriend out of participating in the murder saved her. We have touched on many of the sensational themes in this story, and I suppose that by now you can understand why the news of this brutal murder was on everyone's lips. It was one of the most ruthless attacks Australia has ever seen. Investigators were surprised to learn that the perpetrator had been a woman. And when Tracy's friends went to trial, the public was dumbfounded by the idea that Tracy had them under her spell and that she could control them. The idea that one can be manipulated into murder by someone so influential was hard to swallow, but fun to chew on, I guess. Folks just devoured articles about the unusual disorder that they believed Tracy was afflicted by. Crown prosecutor Adrian Gundelach, now retired, said that the 1989 slaying of Edward Baldock was one of the most memorable and gruesome of the over 50 murder cases he had handled in his 2 decades with the Department of Public Prosecution. The significant thing in this one was that she had control over 3 people and talked them into being a part of it.
But why was it relevant that Tracey Wigginton was a lesbian? In Chris Michael's book, Bizarrism, he wrote about Tracy's girl gang and the murder of Edward Baldock. He pointed to American folklorist Nordine Dresser, who mentioned the inherently romantic and sexual nature of vampire fantasies, and that for folks who commit attacks like this, drinking the blood of their victims because they believe themselves to be vampires, there is usually a romantic or sexual component to their crime. This makes it all the more shocking that Tracy had selected her victim at random and had chosen a man when she was strictly attracted to women. But since most people don't bother to read the article before they start reacting to the headline, the LGBT community was pissed. They didn't like the idea of lesbians being painted as psychopaths and unrepentant murderers. And of course, this was the 80s, and society already had a hard time accepting lesbians. Stories like this were not helping. Defenders of Wigginton also felt that her horribly abusive childhood, which probably directly related to her struggles with mental illness, was overlooked.
We don't know how true the stories are about Tracy's grandmother, Avril's involvement in the cult, but it is true that she was adopted by her grandparents when her mother abandoned her as a child. Tracy's grandparents had been abusive to their own children as they raised them and continued the pattern with Tracy and her step-sibling. Avril had allegedly regularly whipped her with a cord of an iron, and Tracy claims to have been repeatedly sexually assaulted by her grandfather, George, from a young age. You can find plenty of articles to back up countless stories of wretched abuse against Tracy by her grandparents, but I guess it all falls pretty close to speculation, as both of her grandparents were already dead at the time of the murder. In 1996, the Courier-Mail journalist Ella Riggert had the opportunity to interview Wiggington in prison. Tracy gave the journalist a graphic description of the murder. This is a quote: "6 years on, I can still smell the river, the smell of blood, the smell of metal that has been left to rust in the rain. Then I started to stab him. You think nothing goes through your mind. There is no emotion, just blind fury. But once I started, I couldn't stop. I couldn't see Mr. Baldock. I kept seeing my grandmother, my grandfather, my mother, my father, and all the people in my life who had hurt me. It was such blind fury, I was able to pick a dead man up with 2 knives. Afterwards, I sat down against the roller door with my arms resting on my knees. I was like a husk or a shell of a volcano. The public has no idea what my dreams are like at nighttime. It's never over. I don't think about it constantly, but whenever I'm alone or having a quiet moment, I think about it and then I cry. Murder is a terrifying experience. It's extremely scary to have that much power. It's like playing God with life and death. Nobody should have that sort of power, but we all do."
Ugh, that's chilling.
So chilling.
In 2006, Tracy assaulted both a guard and a fellow prisoner, which led to her being moved to a higher security prison. Before prison, Tracy was a high school dropout, but while incarcerated, she got her Bachelor of Arts, double majoring in anthropology and philosophy. She continued to appeal for parole every chance she got until 2011, when her application was finally accepted. Tracey Wigginton was released from prison in January of 2012, and in recent years has caused a bit of a stir as she continued to post threatening messages and stuff about vampires on her Facebook page. Released at age 46, Tracy was suffering from diabetes. She'd put on some considerable weight, and she now walks with the aid of crutches. She's a far cry from the powerful young woman she was back in 1989. Still, some are concerned that 22 years is not enough time served, and that Tracy is still a threat to the community. Tracey Wigginton has publicly renounced vampirism and now denies that she ever thought of herself as a vampire. She's also expressed a deep remorse for the murder and has tried to reach out to Edward Baldock's family on several occasions seeking forgiveness. Conditions of her release include that she's not permitted to write any books or publish any works that would result in her profiting off her crime, and she's forbidden from getting in touch with her accomplices or her victims' surviving family. And that is the story of the lesbian vampire killer.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've heard the headline on that before, but I didn't know much about it going into this. And so sad, so terrifying.
Yeah. It's funny how things can be so removed because we're nowhere near Australia. And like something that's like the most sensational thing of the century is something that we, knew very little about. So It's nice to dig into that. But it's weird, I guess, or maybe it's expected to find that, criminal trials have the same issues in various countries. A lot of people, whenever it comes to dissociative identity disorder and that coming up as to explain murder, it always becomes a lot of controversy for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, it's a lot to process.
Yeah. So as for TV this week, I don't know about you, but I've just been binging You season 3 pretty exclusively. That's like the only thing I've watched this week.
Yeah, that's also the only thing I had time for this week. And I was so worried I wouldn't have time for it because I was getting myself back home and like dealing with travel and stuff. And I was like, oh God, I have to like squeeze in as many things as I can in Spain before I leave. I don't have time to watch You. But please believe I made time to watch the entire season in like 2 days. I'm done. I finished it.
So I'm definitely not finished it. And I can't believe you managed to finish it while simultaneously exploring Spain. So that was a really, what a feat to squeeze that in.
I don't know how I managed, but
I
think I sprained my toe on my last day in Spain. So I was like, trying to walk around a bit and then I took a break. Yeah, I'm fine. I tripped over my husband's suitcase that was in the middle of our large hotel room floor on the path to the bathroom where one keeps suitcases. And it still hurts and it's definitely still messed up. But so like the last day there, I just couldn't do as much as I wanted to. And midday,
put your foot up, watch some TV.
Like, I'm gonna rest my foot and I'm gonna watch serial killer shows.
Excellent. Yeah, so good. I guess I can't say much about what's going on there. I'm sure like most of you are watching, but I'm so far pretty thrilled too. I think what did I watch? Episode 4 last night, maybe. I'm pretty psyched with where it's going.
Yeah. So I have 2 thoughts about it that are not spoilers. One is a potential trigger warning for people. I think it's around episode 4 or 5. There is a violent squirrel death. And I thought about you, Angelina.
Okay, I don't think I've seen the squirrel death.
Okay, it must be the next episode. And I actually was going to text you, but then I wasn't sure what episode I was on, and I was too lazy to move my mouse up my screen to see which episode I was on to send you a text. I was like, I'll do it later. And then I forgot. But be warned, there is a violent squirrel murder.
Oh my God. I'm probably going to be more distraught about that than the average person. I've just become really, I don't know. I feel for squirrels, you know? It's like, I feel like now that I know some squirrels, like when I'm in the park and I see the squirrels, it's like I can read their facial expressions. It's like I can, you know, when I see squirrels approach out in the world, I'm like, I can just read on their faces that like they're up for it. Like they would be our friends if we wanted to work on it. So by the way, you can make friends with squirrels. I think you all can do it. Everyone should try.
You too can have a squirrel friend.
Yeah, and it's a worthwhile friendship. It's, well, any furry critter that will sit on your lap is definitely
any single
enjoyable.
One.
Yeah. So I don't want to see that squirrel die, but I'm going to watch on anyway.
I'll figure out which episode it's in, and maybe I'll even find the timestamp so you could just like scoot on past it. That's what I should have done as I was watching it, because it's really terrible. Like, and it's longer than it should be, and like it's meant to be upsetting, and it certainly worked. So maybe we'll post that in our show notes. But it's probably episode 5 if y'all are watching. Skip past the squirrel scene. As soon as you see squirrel, fast forward.
Oh yeah, close your eyes.
Yeah.
But I will say also what's not really a spoiler is just like I really appreciated the outlook towards anti-vaxxers.
Yes.
I really, that was fun.
Yeah, I thought that was really well done. And probably my favorite part is the actress that plays the annoying blogger, like influencer, then turned best friend of Love. If you're watching, she's in the show Search Party, and she's in season 4 of Search Party? It was the last season.
Season 4,
Like in the trial, when the character played by Maybe from Arrested Development, I can't remember the actress's name.
I don't know the actress's name, but the character was Dory. And
that's right, Dory.
Yeah.
Her defense attorney, who's kind of like Elle Woods, and has the
but
best,
like even more like over the top with the ditziness and stuff, like just. Yeah,
and
vocal fry every moment.
An Emmy for that vocal fry, because it's not her real
so
voice.
Good.
Like you find out when she's on You that like she definitely has like a bit of a California girl accent, or at least in this show. But she's supposed to be like a California mom, like influencer.
For sure.
But oh my God, it's like the most delicious vocal fry you've ever heard in Search Party. And I just love her as an actress. Like she's always on true crimey shows and murdery shows. And I adore her.
And she's perfect for this one, because I feel like the whole vibe of the show You in general is just like such a cute sort of satire, sort of like they do exactly the cheesy thing that you want them to do. But but it's so over the top in just the right way. I love it.
But like I was talking to Allison, my Pilates instructor, about it, who's also watching it this morning. And the characters they've created for this like little fake, terrible suburban California, somewhere near Palo Alto, they're not parodies. Those are real people. Like they could have written about actual situations about California families and conversations you overhear. Like it's so extra, but very real.
The only parody part is just the murder and the just like overtness of like no one's trying to hide their ridiculous Californianness or their like, weird vocal fry or their strange, opinions.
Oh God,
it's all just like out there. It's great. Love it.
It's really good. I'm enjoying it. So let us know what you think. We did make a little TikTok about it as a placeholder for conversation. So if you're watching it,
jump
and you have
on there and tell us your thoughts.
You can reveal spoilers on there because it's, we'll just be the ones seeing it at this point.
People will only read it if they've also watched it. Yeah. So it's a safe space for spoilers.
Go on past.
Totally. Well, I guess that's enough murder for 1 week, but maybe this week you're feeling a little extra festive. After all, it is spooky season. If you need just a little bit more murder, you can always find us on the OG MurderMurder.news for the latest breaking true crime news articles every day of the week.
You can also find us on Instagram at MurderMurder.news, where we have a featured list of the best paranormal podcasts to binge listen to right now. You can find us on TikTok at MurderMurder.news, where this week we dug into the murder history to find the story of the Denver Spider-Man from the 1940s, which is a really spooky one because it's one of those about like somebody sneaking into your attic and living there.
Yeah. I love it because it was like, it read like a creepypasta, but it was not.
It's not.
This is a true story and a very old one.
So it's really good. And like one of the highlights of the story is that one of the women living in the house ended up moving out because she thought it was a ghost. She believed that like cups being moved around and things being gone from the fridge were like her imagination or a ghost, but it like
but it was straight up way worse than a ghost.
But it was an actual man living in her attic. So go check that out. It's real spooky.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also find us on Twitter at Murder News. And this week we posted a meme about Michael Myers' cool jumpsuit with pockets. And for that one, if you all know the name of the artist, I couldn't figure it out, please let us know because we'd love to give them credit because it's gotten a lot of buzz and they deserve credit.
So cute. Yeah.
And you can also find us on Facebook just by searching for Murder News.
Yeah, so you'll find our page there. And also if you search Murder News, you'll find our little group that will also pop up. You'll want to join us to stay in the loop about things like our book club and to RSVP for our Zoom Halloween party coming up on the 31st.
And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoyed today's episode, because reviews are so important if you want to keep this podcast alive and to keep creating creepy content catered to your interests.
Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and see you next Friday.
Bye, friends.
Bye.
Murder, murder.